Hello and welcome to this course on Companies Act 2030. I am Dr. Sulphey. I am the Dean of TK Institute of Management, Kollam, Kerala. I am the course instructor. This course consists of about 12 units, and after this course, I am sure you will have a fair understanding about the Companies Act of India. As an introduction, I would say this Companies Act is a branch of law that deals with aspects like the incorporation of companies, the share capital, its membership, management, administration, winding up, and a lot of many other things. In fact, the companies legislation in India, like any other legislations, owes its origin to the English company law. Most company legislations enacted in India from time to time have followed the English Companies Act with certain modifications to fit into the Indian conditions. Now I'm going into the unit 1. It gives the history of the corporate law in India. If you go through the history of the Companies Act in India, it can be divided into two distinct phases. The first one is the pre-independence era, and the next one is the post-independence era. In the pre-independence era, there have been 5 legislations. As you can see, the first one is the Joint Stock Companies Act 1850. The second one is the Joint Stock Companies Act 1857. The third one, Joint Stock Companies Act 1860. Next, the Companies Act 1866 and the Companies Act of 1930. And post-independence, we have two acts. The first one was the Companies Act of 1956, and now we do have the Companies Act of 2013, which we'll be dealing in detail. Now let's look into the Joint Stock Companies Act of 1850. This act was the first ever Companies Act in India, and it provided for the registration of joint stock companies, and it was passed in 1850 in the British Parliament. This act was based on an English Companies Act known as the Joint Stock Companies Act of 1844. However, though the act recognized the company as a distinct legal entity, it did not grant the privilege of limited liability to its members. So it was the biggest drawback in this particular act. So to tide over this particular drawback, the Joint Stock Companies Act of 1857 was enacted, and this replaced the Act of 1850. The Joint Stock Companies Act of 1857 conferred the benefit of limited liability to its members. However, this benefit was not extended to members of the banking and insurance company. So again, this was another drawback that existed for this particular act. Now, the next act was enacted repealing to the earlier act, and it's known as the Joint Stock Companies Act of 1860. The Joint Stock Companies Act of 1860 extended the benefit of limited liability to the members of banking as well as insurance companies. And that act was in force for just a couple of years, and it was again replaced by another act known as the Companies Act of 1866. We can say that this Companies Act of 1866 was the first comprehensive Companies Act ever passed in India. This act was in fact based on the English Companies Act of 1862. The act consolidated the law relating to incorporation, regulation, and the winding up of trading companies as well as the other associations. This act was in force for a couple of years as against the earlier acts which were in force only for a few years. Thereafter, in 1913, another act was passed. It is also known as the Indian Companies Act. However, this act has had a few limitations, like it did not take into account certain peculiar features of the Indian trade and commerce. For instance, it did not include the institution in India which was vogue in India. For example, the management agency. This act was found to be highly unsatisfactory in the course of its operation, and due to these things, a large number of amendments were made from time to time. However, this act was in existence till India attained independence. So now let us deal with the Companies Act after independence. So the first Companies Act in independent India was the Companies Act of 1956. This act was enacted because the earlier acts were found to be totally inadequate to deal with the situations that were prevalent in India. The government of India appointed a committee in October 25, 1950 to review the earlier act, that is the Companies Act of 1930. The committee consisted of 13 members who were drawn from various fields, and the chairman was Sri H.C. Bhabha. The committee submitted, after due deliberations and going into almost all aspects of the Indian corporate scenario, submitted its reports in the year 1950. Based on the recommendations of the report, the Companies Act 1956 was passed. This act came into force on April 1, 1956. The act was a comprehensive and a massive one. It contained 658 sections and 14 schedules. So you can understand the volume of the act from this statement. Thereafter, this Companies Act 1956 was amended as many as 24 times. And there will be two major amendments. The first one was in 1988. This amendment was made after considering the recommendations of a committee known as the Sachar Committee. Thereafter, in 2002, another major amendment was also made to this particular act, and this was based on the report of the High Power ARD Committee. Considering the proliferation and various amendments of the act, an attempt was made to bring in a new law. And not only that, there was drastic changes in the Indian business landscape after it was opened up in the year 1990. And not that the open market required lesser government controls of the corporate world. And there was also the need of corporate democracy, which was doing its waves around the globe. And this particular scenario which came into existence in India necessitated a new act, and the Companies Act of 2013 was enacted. So this is the act which we are going to deal in detail. The presidential assent for the bill was received in August 29, 2013. This act was in fact a major step that facilitated ease of doing business, because the earlier act had what we called something known as the license Raj, because there was a license was required in almost all aspects of the corporate world. So not only that, the adequate protection was also given to small investors in this act, and so this is a major step forward as regarding the corporate law in India is concerned. Now, what you see here is the Gazette, which brings out the date in which the Companies Act was enacted, as well as it came into force. So now, let's recap what we have seen in this section. In this particular unit, we have seen the history of the corporate law. We saw the pre-independence history of the Companies Act of India, as well as we saw the post-independent history of the corporate law in India. Now, from Unit 2 onwards, we'll be going deep into the Companies Act of 2013. So, come on, welcome to Unit number 2. Bye.